questions you want to ask about Old Testament stuff? I know covering the whole Old Testament is an hour is a joke, but yeah. Yeah.
How do you best discern, like, when you're reading the law and determining what things, like, changed or didn't change? Because, like, it's not like a direct, like, Jesus doesn't talk about every single
Yeah.
law. And it's like,
Yeah, how do we discern what's valid and what's not? It's a tricky thing, because I think we have to look at, again, the whole witness of Scripture. So some of those laws, even in the Old Testament, what's interesting is some of those laws were clearly written for when they were like a nomadic people. So even by the time of Jesus, even the Pharisees weren't obeying those rules. And you even find some of those differences in the Exodus version of the law by the time the Deuteronomy version of the law comes, because the Deuteronomy version is like, now you have a home. And so the law was not quite as static as maybe we imagine it. And even as long as it seems, because there's like 614, if you kind of add them all together or something is the number I've seen. I've never tried. But even with that, it's like we can't actually reproduce what their culture was like. It's clear that it's not complete. They had to have more rules. What we get is a mix of things. Some of them seem to be almost what we call case law. So we have the core law of like, you can't kill anyone. But then there's questions that arise in situations like, well, what happens if an animal that I own kills someone? And then so they'll have like some rules around that, but you would still, there's no way it covers every situation. And so you get in the law some like, this is the kind of decision making that has to happen. How you sort of, they're trying to extract things. And that's why by the time of Jesus, you've got the rabbis have these, written tomes and tomes and tomes of like, what does this mean for our life in our day and that kind of stuff. The problem was they held their words up equally with God's and sort of ignored God's intent. And that's where you see Jesus. He's like, I don't care about your rules. But it's not like he didn't do any of them. The synagogue is not in the law. It was something that emerged much later as a place you would go on Sabbath. They made all that up. Jesus did it. He did it. It seemed like it was his custom to do it every week. And he would go, and if it was time for him to read, he'd read. If it was time to speak, he'd speak. So he's not completely defying everything, but he is at points. So, yeah, the New Testament makes clear that, like, the food laws, Jesus declared those foods clean. But it reaffirms a lot of what we would consider, like, the moral laws. So, I think I make this point later, but, like, in Galatians, where, it's all like, we are not saved by the law. Like, absolutely not. Grace, da-da-da-da-da. And then at the very end, he's like, the acts of the sinful nature are obvious. Sexual morality and greed and envy and fits of rage. And he goes, people that live like that won't inherit the kingdom. It's like, well, how do those things fit together, right? It's like, you just told me it wasn't by law. He's like, he's not talking about the law in the sense of like the moral law. It's like, yes, obviously we still pursue God's highest visions of morality. But he is kind of like, but some of this other stuff, the circumcision and Sabbath stuff, the stuff that made Jews separate from Gentiles, because that's his big point in Galatians, is remember the whole story or the whole section kind of starts with his relationship with Peter. He's like, yeah, Peter, I'm kind of preempting myself, but he's like, Peter accepted my gospel and then stopped eating with Gentiles. And I had to rebuke him in front of everyone. And it's like, okay, so the whole context of this is about Jews separating themselves from people that aren't Jews. And Paul's like, no, that is going back to the law. That is rejecting Jesus and his whole gospel. Not like trying to not murder people, but that's not Paul's problem with them, is that they think, So again, we read that sometimes through our lens and we miss the context of what he's talking about. Does that help? But it is a bigger question, and I think there are certain ones where it's like, okay, is this? That's why I think if it was so clear to us that it's like, well, obviously anything about women is old. But it's not obvious. We have to put it on our thinking caps. So, yeah. Other questions? Okay, let's talk about Jesus. Jesus' example. And I will draw pretty heavily when I'm talking about this and even the next section from Luke and Acts, because Luke, who wrote those two books, the same author wrote those, women seem to be like a special concern of his. He mentions them way more, gives more details, inserts them into the narrative to make sure we kind of know what's going on way more. So I'll be drawing from that. And there's a great little book, the story Luke tells, and it has a chapter that I really found helpful on Luke and gender, how he kind of thinks about all that and what he seems to be doing. So, but I want to talk about some societal kind of realities. This is the context that Jesus seems to come into, and we actually know quite a bit about this because now we're in a time period when we have a lot more records that aren't just the Bible. We have lots of writings of rabbis and things like that, so we know. So we know that, I've already lost. Why is this all of a sudden dead? It wasn't dead like 3 minutes ago. But so Jesus, or when Jesus comes, women are blamed for all evil in the world. And this kind of goes back to Eve on the basis of Genesis. Like they're seen as like, we wouldn't have evil if we didn't have women. The women are separated and silenced in the synagogue. So they had to sit in a separate area and they could listen to the discussion that the men had, but they were not allowed to participate, take part in that. Speaking, they couldn't really speak with men in public. So only in private. So that was pretty frowned upon. And the Pharisees, who were the most strict with this, typically wouldn't even talk to their wives or daughters in front of anyone in a public area. That was only for home. So they could only talk to each other. They had no right to divorce. So whereas men, under the interpretation of the law, they could divorce for any reason or any cause, and this had come from Rabbi Hillel before, and that may be when Jesus talks about divorce and he says whoever divorces his wife for any reason other than this, he may be actually using more of a technical term, that he's arguing against any cause or any reason divorce, not more generally saying for any reason, because that was the phrase, is that men could divorce their wife for any reason. And the example the rabbis gave was like if she burned your breakfast. But women could not initiate a divorce. And then there was all this stuff about them being unclean. They were unclean after childbirth. They were unclean twice as long if it was a girl that they had. After any sexual event, they were unclean. Menstrual bleeding made them unclean. And then their testimony wasn't valid in any court or business proceeding. So they couldn't testify to anything legal or business related. And then they basically received no education. Outside of just the home. By about 75 BC, so 75 years before Jesus is born, it seems that elementary education had become compulsory for boys, at least through elementary, basic stuff. But that for religious education, like many rabbis considered it a waste of time to teach the law to women. One wrote, better to burn the precepts of the law than to teach them to a woman.
Oh.
Yeah. There was the prayer that you may have heard quoted. It's like, God, thank you for not making me, a Gentile, a slave, or a woman, that kind of thing. So what I think is interesting here is how, I just think it's pretty remarkable how Jesus sort of deliberately defies every single one of these, just in the short accounts that we have. This pen, Lindsay, you got a better mark for me? Yeah, it was like I'm dying here. Much better. So yeah, as we start looking at Jesus, he never refers to the Eden story or Eve to explain human sin or the way that humans die. He does he refers to it when he addresses adultery or divorce later on, but that's more in protection of women. So he doesn't. Yeah. I don't know. Let's see how to do this. He never physically separated men from women in his public teaching. So you think about like when the crowd of 5,000 is there, it talks about how they divide them up. And it specifically mentions how many, that there were this many men, but also the women were there, and that they grouped them in groups of 50, and no separating them out when he's teaching, like they would do in the synagogue. He never differentiates between men and women in any instruction or invitation to discipleship, or description of the kingdom of God, or his promise to send the Spirit. Like he never specifies, I'm going to do this for men only, or something like that. All of his teachings are generally just given to the people there, and there's a call to follow. I'm not going to write all these, but he often spoke to women in public. And you can probably think of some of these, but his mother at the wedding at Cana, Martha at Lazarus's tomb, the woman caught in adultery, the Samaritan woman at the well. And if you remember that story in John 4 with the Samaritan woman, John tells us that the disciples were shocked. They don't say he was shocked. They were shocked because he was speaking to a Samaritan. They were shocked because he was speaking to a woman. The woman who anointed his feet with perfume at that thing, when everyone else is whispering about her, Jesus talks to her. So he speaks with no hesitation or restraint. And just as a side note, this woman, this Samaritan woman, is presented in that story as sort of the evangelist to her whole village, right? She goes out, she's the one that brings people back so that he can teach. With divorce, he restricts the men. Again, a protection here, but that he talks about it's the hardness of men's hearts is the reason that God gave a not very good command. It's like, and again, that helps us frame our discussion of what is law. It's that there are commands that God gives that are concessions to you're pretty bad, so we're not going to get any worse than this. Because the certificate of divorce thing, again, it was designed as a protection for women. Because the danger would be, if you didn't have a certificate of divorce, that you go start, marry someone else and start living with them, and then your original husband comes back and says, you're still married to me, adulteress, and they could kill her for that. But with a certificate of divorce, she had proof that she was not that man's husband. Or wife, whatever, And so, again, it's not a great thing, but it is designed to protect her and to protect her dignity and give her options in the future. Jesus just sort of ignored uncleanness. And especially you think about, when the bleeding woman, the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years touched him. It's like, he is unfazed by this stuff. He just wasn't worried about that. And he does that more generally with lepers. When he helps the widow outside of Nain who, her son had died, and Jesus goes and touches that dead body. And so he's doing all sorts of stuff, just kind of ignoring the uncleanness from touching women. And I would say that for Jesus, like, women's testimony isn't just valid, but important. So we talked about the Samaritan woman, but all 4 resurrection accounts, the different gospel writers are pretty clear, and they all tell different details, but they all agree that it was women who were the first to see him and the first to tell the news of his resurrection. And in multiple of them, they're the ones who are commanded to tell the news of his resurrection, that they are the ones whose testimony he wanted. As for religious education, it's clear that these women were included with the men. And there are a number of references that make this clear, but none probably more emphatically than the Luke 10. You can go there if you want. Luke 10:38. This is the story of Mary and Martha. Get there. So, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things. But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what's better, and it will not be taken from her." So Mary chooses what is traditionally a man's role over what is traditionally a woman's role. And Jesus doesn't say, like, "I'll let her do it this once." He says, she's made a better choice. And I'm not taking that away from her. He wishes Martha would choose that, right? You're worried about things that don't really matter. There are bigger deals here. This language of where it says that Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said, that is like traditional disciple rabbi language. So look, if you want to look over in Acts, again, remember, same author, Acts 22, verse 3, this is where Paul is telling his kind of testimony, one of the times he does this in Acts. It says, "Then Paul said, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel." And again, the length, you missed this, you can look at a couple other versions. He says, "I sat at Gamaliel's feet." And Gamaliel is a famous rabbi. Like, we know of Gamaliel from outside the Bible. He was one of the big deal kind of people. But so probably if you look at, yes, so like the ESV, a more like word for word translation, he says, I brought up in the city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. So this idea of sitting at someone's feet is like disciple, rabbi language. And that's what seems to be used here for Mary and affirmed by Jesus. Now, Jesus did only choose 12 men as apostles. And I think we have to ask the question of why. Some have thought propriety, because these are people that are like traveling together and going out into the wilderness together and things like that. They're disappearing for long periods of time. And so what would that have looked like, if the women were on those trips? But I think more importantly, this 12 men thing seems to be a very symbolic act. No one would have missed, in Judaism, where it's like everything is about the 12 tribes that came from these 12 brothers and all of that, no one would have missed the significance of Jesus. He didn't work his way up to 12. He just one day is like, "You 12. You are my people." That he's sort of reconstituting Israel around himself. People would have gotten that. And the irony is, some of these men who are in this 12 are mentioned less, and we know less about them than some of his women disciples. Some of these people don't seem very important other than the fact that they rounded out the 12. that they got us to the number. So, some of them, it's like we know their name, but we don't, we know more about Mary Magdalene, for example. We actually have encounters and stories about her. Jesus always had women disciples. If you look at Luke 8, 1-3, Luke tells us that the women were actually sort of the breadwinners for this group. It was their money that supported all of those men to be in ministry. We see that women are Jesus' most faithful disciples when the going got tough. They are the ones, other than John and who was at the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, who came afterwards to help bury him. It's only the women who are at the cross, at the tomb, when it was most dangerous. We see again the women as the first witnesses of the resurrection, the first to tell the gospel. And as Luke transitions the story in Acts, the Spirit that was promised by Jesus is poured out on both men and women. And that's where we see Joel, that we read earlier, quoted. And Joel just sort of stresses equality in receiving the Spirit. He sort of breaks down all of the distinctions. It's not just Jews, it's on all people. It's not just men, it's on the women. It's not just the young or just the old, it's on all ages. It's not just the free people, it's on the slaves too. Every major distinction that you see being made in the ancient world, Joel's like, them too.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
How come it was most dangerous at the tomb and at the cross for women?
Well, I don't think it was most dangerous for women. I think it was just you see most of his disciples are in hiding because it's like they've taken, this is a political killing. And so most of his people go hide. People have thought that John is probably there. John seems to have some higher status than the others. As you see in one of the gospel accounts where John is actually able to get into the high priest's house when the trial is going on, and he's not sneaking in. It's like, so he's got some clout or connection, because not just anyone is walking in the high priest's house during their trial of Jesus. And Peter goes with him, but it's clear that it's John's deal. So maybe he felt like he had enough cover, to be able to be there, but most of them are just kind of in hiding. And you could say it's like, oh, well, they weren't worried about women, but we'll see here in a minute that no, they were very willing to take out these women as well. We'll look at that in a second. The Spirit's poured out, equality is stressed, and nowhere in the New Testament is it mentioned that some spiritual gifts are for men only or for women only. That's just never talked about. And it does seem that gifting is what drives ministry in the New Testament. So I think about like Acts 21:9, where it talks about Philip's 4 daughters who are all prophets. It's like they're prophets because they were given the gift of prophecy, not because they kind of decided to do that. And so Acts 21:9, Philip's 4 daughters who are prophets. When I reflect on Jesus, I see a clear preference in Jesus for love and the movement of the Spirit over adherence to rules, and sometimes even rules like written by God. He just seems to be much more concerned with what the Spirit is doing than sort of obeying all those. So I think about like Luke 6:1-11 is one of the texts about the Sabbath. In this case, he's not healing. His disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath and just eating it as they walk, and that was one of the things, you can't harvest food on the Sabbath. And so, and it's like, all right, they're like literally taking like one bite. It's like, nope, that's harvesting. And Jesus tells this story from the Old Testament, from Samuel, where David is hungry and is like, he's on the run from Saul, and he goes into the temple and he eats the bread that the law says can only be for the priests, and no one like criticizes him for it. And it's just that he's just like, yeah, like, haven't you read? It's like if you're hungry, you can break the rule. I don't know. It's just kind of this weird thing that we don't have time to dig into, but you see generally he's kind of fussing with them over when rules become more important than people. And that doesn't seem to be what he's about. So he'll say things like, the Sabbath rule wasn't, or people weren't made for the Sabbath rule. The Sabbath rule was made for people. Right? Jesus never rebukes a woman in the Gospels for seeking or serving God. But he does rebuke a number of people, mostly men, and the woman that we looked at earlier, for criticizing women who are seeking or serving God. Now, the one possible exception to this might be the story of the Syrophoenician woman. That's the woman that comes, it's in Mark 7:24-30, where she comes, she's not Syrophoenician, she's a Gentile. She wants her daughter delivered from this demon, and Jesus says, I came for the lost sheep of Israel. It's not good to give the dogs what's meant for the children, right? And what? And she goes, yeah, but even the dogs eat the scraps that fall off the children's table, those messy kid eaters, And he's like, okay, I'll heal her. and there's this interesting scene that the thing, he doesn't rebuke her. He maybe tells her no in the first place. But some people have pointed out that, we still tell stories today, because they're famous in the Gospels, of all of the people Jesus out-talks, right? Every trap they make for him, you've got these, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God's what's God's. And it's like, oh, no one would dare talk to him anymore, because they couldn't, it's like no matter all their smart people, couldn't out-talk Jesus. The only person who ever out-talks Jesus is this woman. She gets exactly what she can afford. And he's amazed at her faith in doing that. She's not trying to trap him, she's trying to get her daughter healed. And he meets her in that. As we move forward into Acts, and especially looking at Paul's ministry, here is going to be our big challenge, because we're going to look at Paul's ministry, and then we're going to look at these 4 texts from Paul's letters. This is why we would have to have a long class on this, is that Paul's example, what he does and what we see happening in his ministry, is inconsistent with the most simple or obvious readings of these main texts that we're going to look at. The other challenge is that simple reading of those main texts are inconsistent with each other too. But it's a muddy picture. It is a muddy picture, and there's not going to be anything that I'm going to be like, oh yes, like everything will make perfect sense to you by the end of today. It's just muddy. I think the thing we have to consider is that maybe God is okay with that, because maybe his goal wasn't a clear picture of a timeless church structure. Because again, if that was his goal, I don't think it was very well done. I don't think that's his goal. I don't think that this is all meant to mandate exactly how we do everything forever. But again, you have to consider that yourself. So, let's look at Paul's ministry. So, when he was going by Saul in Acts 9, if you want to look real fast, since we've been in Acts 9, verse 2. It says, or we can look at 1. He says, but Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciple of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So you see that in the beginning, even pre-Jesus, Saul sees Christian women as a threat. And so that gives us some indication of the role they're playing in the church even before him. As we read through both Acts and then all of those greetings and things that are in his letters, you start seeing that women are extensively included in his ministry team. At least 12 are called by name. The most common word that he uses to describe other people is co-workers. And so the word is synergos or synergoi. And when you look at who he calls co-workers, they are people like Timothy, Titus, Epaphroditus, Mark, who wrote the Gospel Mark, but also Priscilla and her husband Aquila, Urbanus, Euodia and Syntyche and Clement, Euodia and Syntyche being women, Aristarchus, Mark, Justus, Philemon, Aristarchus again, Demas, and Luke, who wrote the other gospel. So this is kind of his general word for his kind of primary ministry people. And there's just a number of women that even in our few references who get that title from him. 3 women are known as leaders of house churches, which is the only type of church there was in the first century. So 1 Corinthians 1:11 seems like Chloe is, Nympha in Colossians 4:15, Aphia in Philemon 2. So he addresses these women or talks about them in the church that meets in their home or their household.
Can you repeat those verses?
1 Corinthians 1:11. Again, I'll publish this so you can follow along. But Nympha, Colossians 4:15, Aphia, Philemon 2. Paul stated that 4 women, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis, these are all in Romans 16, had worked very hard in the Lord. And this Greek that's translated, worked very hard, was regularly used by Paul in his letters to refer to like the special work of gospel ministry, including his own ministry. He does that. There's I have 6 different references where he uses that phrase talking about his ministry, as well as others in the ministry, and I have a bunch more references. So probably for Paul, the term work very hard, he probably wasn't using that casually to refer to like doing the dishes or something like that. This was his kind of phrase of what it meant to work in ministry. But one of our challenges is Paul is just not very big on titles beyond the title apostle. He just doesn't really use them much. And even that title, he interestingly uses beyond just himself and the 12. He talks about Barnabas as an apostle. In Romans 16, he refers to Andronicus and Janiah, who's a woman, as apostles. And so the apostle just meant one who was sent. They were sent with a message. And so there seemed to be a group they were apostles of Jesus Christ. He puts himself in that category. They were sent directly by Jesus. But there are also apostles who are sent, he never names it, but probably by the church or something. It would be kind of like a word for missionary or something like that. But every title where a man is mentioned by name as having that title, so is a woman in the New Testament. There are roles like this kind of overseer or elder that are talked in general about and only ever sort of referred to as men, but there's no names. We don't know of any of these people. But again, like I said, he just doesn't seem real big on titles. Orders of leadership, some sort of specific structures of like these are titles or leaders emerge seemingly in 1 Timothy. We get overseers, or sometimes it's translated bishops. We get deacons, both male and female. And we get widows. And those are the only roles named in that letter. They each have specific qualifications that they have to meet. And the emphasis is way more on qualifications than any job description of what they were doing. But he talks about these different people, and it seems clear that like they are either in or out of that role. Deacon is a tricky one, and I'll talk about this again in a second, because that's also just the word for servant. So we're kind of guessing when is diakonos, that Greek word, being used in like a general term, like this person is a servant, and when is it like sort of a title, like they are a servant, capital S in the church. But yeah, so you have overseers, deacons. Later on in the letter, he talks about elders, and most people sort of guess that elders is referring to the overseers. But that is never made clear. It's never specified. So bishops and elders might be the same thing. But yeah, so overseers, deacons, male and female, and widows. Interestingly, most conservative churches keep elders and male deacons and remove women deacons and any sort of order of widows. So we just sort of take out the two, levels of leadership for women and say we're being really biblically conservative because we've kept the two that have men. But we say we're just doing what Paul did, but we aren't. It's very selective. It's very inconsistent. Paul doesn't say that the church is built on the foundation of the overseers and pastors. He says it's built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And those are both titles that are given to women in the New Testament. And so you have titles like apostle, prophet, deacon, co-worker that refer to specific women. The word pastor is an interesting one because that's like our favorite word. I even had it come up within the last couple of weeks that one of the students was like, I don't think women can be pastors. They can't have the title of pastor. And I was like, interesting. I was like, no one is ever given the title of pastor in the New Testament. The word pastor is only used once in that way, which is, and it's in the plural, and it's in Ephesians 4:11. And the context is gifting from Jesus, right? That he is, he says that Jesus gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be pastors and teachers and evangelists, and to prepare God's people for work and service. So it's almost like the role is a spiritual gifting from God. And he lists this word pastor, but that's the only time it ever gets used because it's just their word for shepherd. So it's the same word that gets used when the shepherds visit the baby Jesus. It's the same word that gets used when Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. It's just sort of drawing on that language. So we can guess at what that role is in the church or what that leadership thing. It's like, yeah, you're kind of being a shepherd. And it gets referred to in general ways of like, Jesus telling Peter, like, feed my sheep. That would be a pastoral kind of shepherding as a spiritual leadership role. But again, it's not really used as a title anywhere. Jesus uses that word in his parables a lot because he talks about shepherds a lot. But yeah, so that's the pastor thing. That's kind of a weird hill to die on. It's just not really a New Testament word much. Acts 16, we see Lydia as like the beginning of the church in Philippi. We see her persuading Paul to do what she wants instead of what he wants, where in terms of where he stays and stuff when he's there. And a lot of people think she's probably another house church leader. She was some sort of prominent woman, and is not presented as like having a husband or something, but as a dealer in purple cloth. Purple was like the most expensive of the dyes, and so she's probably a wealthy person. Priscilla, who's either referred to as Priscilla or Prissa, depending on your translation and stuff, is really important. And I actually want to look at her for a minute. We're going to go to Acts 18. This is where she pops up. And then she's mentioned a bunch of times in the letters. But let's look at 1-3. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. So this is where Paul meets them. They seem to already be Christians. They are Jewish Christians, and they've come from Rome, but now they're living in Corinth. So in this first mention, he meets Aquila and his wife Priscilla. Now if we go further down in this passage, when Paul leaves, so go down to verse 18, and we see Paul probably a year and a half-ish later leaving. It says, after this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow, and they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. So Priscilla and Aquila stay in Ephesus. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I'll return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and blah, 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 blah. So then skip down to 24. It says, now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. So remember, Paul has left Ephesus, but he has left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. And they were part of his ministry. He was an eloquent man, Apollos, competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. So Corinth is the capital of Achaia. So he's going back to where they've been. They know people there, so they write him a letter to go with that. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So here we have this interesting story. Number one, when you look, she's mentioned 7 times, always with her husband. And then 5, we've seen 2 of them here, but 5 of the 7 times, her name is mentioned first, which is actually highly unusual in the ancient world, to list a woman's name before her husband's name. So she is in some sense more important than him. That could be, it's a possibility that meant that she was of higher social standing or something like that. It could be that she was, again, given that Luke doesn't seem super concerned with social standing in the world, I would read that as she was probably the more prominent leader in this relationship. So when they are described as teaching Apollos, who is himself a teacher, her name is listed first in this teaching thing. And so, she, as a leader in Paul's ministry, teaches Apollos, who's a male preacher. And there's just no hint that this is problematic in any way. Romans 16 is a really important passage if you want to go there. This is lots of greetings and things like that, but it has a couple of key things. So, verse 1, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. And then greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. There's that co-worker term, who risked their necks for my life. What am I in? The ESV, sorry, I got it split over. The NIV, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon. Remember I told you it's like, there's some, the translators make a call. And so the ESV, which comes from a very conservative tradition, chooses to not give her the title deacon. And the NIV that comes from a more middle of the road is no, it seems like this is not just a general servant thing. Most people think that typically with these letters of commendation, that was the person carrying the letter. And that probably the person carrying the letter was the one responsible for explaining any questions about the letter. And so most likely, she has this role of deacon in the church at Cenchrea. And again, that word deacon or servant gets used for lots of people. Both more generally, Christ gets called a servant. Apollos, Epaphras, Timothy, Tychicus, Paul calls himself that. He talks about them more generally in different places. Again, if you get my notes, you can see all these verse references. So I think it's at least a significant possibility that she is sort of the leader, preacher, teacher, main leader of this church in Cenchrea, or of a house church in Cenchrea. And it could be a more general term for servant, but the role of being the letter carrier of the book of Romans is a big role for some menial worker. that would be unlikely. So most likely, she is the first expository teacher of Romans. She's the first. She knew what Paul meant. She had been there when he wrote it. She delivers it, and if they have questions, she would be the person that has access to any more information. So if you go down a little, we see Priscilla listed again, called a co-worker. The next one that's important is in verse 7. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. Which again, here you have a woman being thrown into prison for, her faith and that kind of thing. She got imprisoned with Paul. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. This outstanding among, people kind of question, does this mean, of all the apostles, they stand out? Or does it mean that they're highly esteemed by, the apostles like them or something? And those are both possible translations. What I can say is for the first few hundred years of the church, even the authors that generally looked down on women as leaders, everyone consistently believed that Junia was a woman and that she was called an apostle. No one, that translation of esteemed by emerged much, much later, very recently. What also happened was in the 13th century, translators just started changing Junia to Janias. They just added an S to make it a man's name. Because it was a woman can't be an apostle. So clearly Paul left off a letter or something. I don't know. But you kind of see how, we all bring our own biases to the text and to our readings. But generally, the early church, everyone sort of accepted, again, not that she's an apostle like the 12. She's not an apostle of Jesus Christ, but she was given this title that was highly esteemed in the church. So, to sum all that up, and then we'll take a pause, Paul's ministry, and I don't mean just in the church at large, I mean specifically in the ministry under the influence of the guy who wrote these letters that we're about to read from, had a number of women in key roles. He called them by all the highest titles that he used for the church. He called them the same titles that he called men. And we have a key example of a woman in his ministry teaching a man. And I think we need that context before we try to understand what Paul wrote. And I think we need to remember that all of this is just as much from God's word as any other text. Though obviously we use different parts differently and more or less. So let's take another pause. If you want, I'll take more a 5-minute break if you want to run to the bathroom or anything like that. But also, again, just share with a neighbor what's surprising, any questions you have, and then we'll dive into those texts for the last chunk of this.